We'll open the Senate Minerals Committee on Monday, February 3rd. And Sue, would you do the roll call, please?
Senator Cooper,
Here.
Senator Jones. Here. Senator Nethercott,
Here?
Senator Rothfuss,
Here.
Chairman Anderson.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
So we have a quorum, and we have some rules about decorum and addressing the chair and being nice to each other and all that kind of stuff. I'll make sure that you do that. First bill before us today is Senate File 92, Make Carbon Dioxide Great Again, no net zero. And I believe we have somebody here to talk about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Sherry Steinmetz from Senate District 3, Goshen, Weston, and Niobrara counties. The spectacular three. Mr. Chairman, I apologize for missing you the other day. I stood in the hallway for quite a while and then went back to the Labor Health Committee, so to do some good work up there. But thank you for taking testimony from those who had traveled. With that, I'd like to just go over a little bit of base information about the genesis of this bill. As you know, the EPA had an endangerment finding, I believe back in 2009, which categorized 6 greenhouse gases as pollutants or contaminants, and that would be CO2 or carbon dioxide, methane, which is CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, perfluorocarbons, PFCs, and sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, and I might have butchered some of that. But as you know, President Trump in his first days in office on January 20th, 2025, has required the EPA to go over those endangerment findings, to reevaluate whether those are considered pollutants, and to reevaluate the stance on that, the federal government stance. In your packet, I have passed down an amendment for you. One of the concerns with this bill that has been raised is the state's primacy over air and Class 6 injection wells. This amendment is designed to take care of that, and it would be inserted on page 4 after line 11. Each agency or department of the state that oversees a federal program for which the state maintains primary regulatory authority shall comply with the policies specified in this subsection B of this section to the greatest extent possible without jeopardizing the state's primacy over the federal program. So that should take care of a lot of the issues. So taking you through the bill, that's the reason for the bill. And as we heard from Senate File 17 and 18 this year, CO2 is in high demand, and this bill seeks to manage it as a resource rather than a pollutant. So it starts out with just talking about the beneficial uses for CO2. Obviously, it's the foundational nutrient for all life on Earth. The carbon cycle is the process by which it is reused and transferred and utilized by our planet. It helps agricultural production across the world. We know greenhouses pump it into their greenhouses. I don't need to tell you all about carbon dioxide because we had a good debate on it. This just asserts that it is the policy of the state of Wyoming that CO2 is a foundational nutrient necessary for all life on Earth, that it shall not be designated or treated as a pollutant or a contaminant, and that the state of Wyoming should not pursue any targets or measures that support the reduction or elimination of carbon dioxide, including any net zero targets. Then the next part is just it was the low carbon emission standards passed, I believe, in 2020. This section repeals that and puts in the old language that was there before that was in place, which we're on page 5 now. And then it just requires that if there's leftover funds from that, because, you know, they can recover funds from the ratepayer, there's the 45Q tax credit, there's also the fact that they could sell the CO2 as well, that they would just refund those funds to the ratepayer. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that is the bill, and I would stand for any questions.
Senator, we got another paper also that shows some administrative impact. Have you seen that?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's what the amendment is designed to address, because that has to do with the Water Quality Division and the Air Quality Division of DEQ. I'm sure they'll be here to speak on it, but that's what the amendment pertains to, so that they can maintain primacy. This would be a reduction in their program for not having the Class 6 injection well program for CO2. So that's why the genesis of this amendment, if you need to tweak it a little, but that's what the amendment is designed to take care of.
So if your amendment passes, we won't have that administrative cost. Is that what
That's
you're
what
saying?
I'm hoping, because
Yeah, okay,
they
okay.
maintain primacy.
Okay, all right. Any other questions for this presenter? Other questions on the amendment or on the papers? Other questions, No, hearing none. Thank you, Senator Steinmetz,
Thank you.
for your presentation. Is there any agencies that would like to speak on this bill? Any agencies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Todd Parfit, Director of the Department of Environmental Quality, and with me is Nancy Veer, the Air Quality Division Administrator, and Jennifer Zigmund, the Water Quality Administrator. Just like to start out and say our main concern was with page 4, lines 5 through 11, so the Romanets 2 and 3. As the sponsor of the bill had mentioned, there was an endangerment finding, but I'll take you a little bit back further. In 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision that authorized EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. And then in 2009, EPA followed that up with its greenhouse gas endangerment finding. The consequence of that was that greenhouse gases, which includes CO2, is considered a pollutant at the federal level. And for us, if we have primacy at the state level. So the impact, the way the bill is currently structured, is that it impacts primacy for air quality and water quality programs. With water quality, it's the Class 6 underground injection control program, which is for carbon capture and sequestration. There are currently 4 states that have primacy for the Class 6 UIC program. Wyoming obtained primacy in 2020. We were the second state, so you have North Dakota, Wyoming, Louisiana, and West Virginia all have primacy today. And there are approximately 20 other states that are seeking primacy for the CCS program. On the air quality side, I think this is a little more straightforward, and there's some history here. But greenhouse gases would be regulated by EPA Region 8 as opposed to the state as they are today. All other industry emissions besides the CO2 would be regular greenhouse gases would be regulated by DEQ. So the net result is you would need to work with 2 permitting agencies. So for the greenhouse gases, you would need a permit from EPA. And then for all other emissions, you would need a permit from the state. And that would impact industry, including power plants, trona mines, refineries, et cetera. Now, this came up after the endangerment finding. The state worked to address that because the way the structure of the statutes were at the time, we wouldn't be able to regulate the greenhouse gases. So the legislature, working with the executive branch at the time, created statutory provisions, namely 3511-213, paragraph E, to avoid that very issue of having 2 permits that an entity would need to obtain. So that's a little bit of the history. Now, I believe that the amendment that the senator had provided to you is the one that we had a conversation around. We still have some concerns with that particular amendment. We are just concerned that it's not particularly clear that we would be able to maintain primacy, and in particular, it's on line 6 where it says, of this section, to the greatest extent possible without jeopardizing the state's primacy over the federal program. There's just a little bit of an ambiguity there. We felt that if this bill were to move forward, we had some language that might actually be a little clearer, and specifically, this policy shall not apply to federal programs for which the department has or seeks primacy or delegated authority for. If implementing this policy would cause the department to lose primacy or delegated authority for those federal programs. But really the key is, and as was mentioned, the EPA administrator will be looking at the endangerment finding. There's no guarantee anything's going to change on that endangerment finding. They're just going to look at that to see if it would be appropriate. So our suggested language would be, if Congress or the final judgment of a federal court prohibits the US EPA from regulating carbon dioxide, then it shall be the policy of the state of Wyoming. Anyway, with that, I'll stop, and we'll stand for any questions about the primacy programs that we do have.
I'm assuming you would write that up and we could make an amendment on the floor or something.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I have that language.
Okay. Questions for? Yes, go ahead there, Senator Cooper.
Chairman. Director, as I'm hearing you, if we pass the bill as it is without the amendment, that would jeopardize our primacy and put the control of the CO2 back in the hands of the EPA. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, most definitely, without any changes, this would jeopardize the primacy of the programs that I discussed.
Other questions for the director? Other questions for the director? Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
I was struck by the word contaminant in the little Romanet 2. Carbon dioxide shall not be designated or treated as a pollutant or contaminant. Is contaminant, is that a term of art in any way in terms of what you do in DEQ? That doesn't strike me as being meaningful.
Mr. Chairman.
Just a minute. Where are you with contaminant?
Sorry, page 4, line 6 is what I'm talking about.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss. I know pollutant is defined in the statute. The contaminant, I'm not certain if that is specifically defined. And I would think that it would also need to be defined by the federal regulations, and I'm not certain if they have that as a definition. But I'm being pointed to, at least for air quality, there's a definition for air contaminant.
Air contaminant? Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Other questions for the director? Other questions? Hearing none, thank you, Director. Any other agencies like to speak on Senate File 92? Go right ahead. Mary, when you're ready.
Moving a little slowly, Mr. Chairman, sorry. Primarily, I'm here to just,
Give us your name.
oh, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Mary Throne, Chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission. In my head, I had already done that, but
You were close.
I am really just here to sort of let the committee know where we are in terms of implementing what we commonly refer to as House Bill 200. The part of this bill repeals the Section 3 repeals our authority under House Bill 200, which, as you may recall, required companies to evaluate the possibilities of carbon capture. That's sort of a pretty brief summary. And they had to own generation in Wyoming, and it allowed them to seek up to 2% in incremental costs for doing that work. So last year, the legislature looked at House Bill 200 and amended it pretty significantly to remove, the effect of that was basically to remove Black Hills Energy from the jurisdiction of the statute. Black Hills Energy is not Cheyenne Light Fuel and Power, which remains in the bill. Black Hills Energy has about 10,000 customers. Well, they don't have that many customers. They have fewer than 10,000 customers in Wyoming, in Northeast Wyoming, and are really part of Black Hills Energy's South Dakota utility. So where we are with Rocky Mountain Power and Cheyenne Light Fuel and Power, Rocky Mountain Power has submitted its final plan, which essentially authorizes them to proceed with a FEED study for carbon capture on Jim Bridger 3 and 4. And then they have some memorandums of understanding with, I'm going to forget the name of the company, with a company to look at alternative technologies on Dave Johnston 4 and Wyodak. Another development in the 2024 Rocky Mountain Power IRP, they identified carbon capture and on Jim Bridger 3 and 4 as part of their preferred portfolio. And we haven't adjudicated that or blessed that in any way. But what that means is that based on current law, current tax credits, current everything, and their modeling, from their perspective, they view carbon capture on Jim Bridger 3 and 4 as an economic generation source. So that would mean that incremental costs of implementing that project, if all the states agreed and moved forward with that, incremental costs would be less, because Wyoming wouldn't be looking at paying the bill for the whole project. But what I really want to emphasize today is we have always taken the position as a commission that we could still reject a project that's not economic. The passage of House Bill 200 did not remove our authority to look at what we always look at, which is the prudence of the investment. Then there was another, and so right now the surcharge for Rocky Mountain Power has gone down to 0.12%. So that means on a $100 bill, it's 12 cents. Black Hills Energy, Cheyenne Light Fuel and Power surcharge is currently 0 because they believe they've collected any incremental costs they've accrued to date for the research that's already been done. And Cheyenne Light Fuel and Power will submit its final plan under House Bill 200 at the end of March. So what I'm trying to say is we're like in the middle of everything with House Bill 200. The other part of House Bill 200, which has received less attention, but as I understand it is in the repealed language, and the sponsor can correct me if I'm wrong, is the legislature required us to establish baseline reliability standards for the utilities to demonstrate, so that we'd have a baseline to determine whether the increase in intermittent generation was affecting the reliability of the grid. And in what you did last year with SF 42, and I believe the other one was SF 34, the reliability provisions came in through two bills. You basically strengthened those reliability requirements, imposed a penalty section, and then gave us a deadline. You know, we all function better with deadlines, Mr. Chairman. So we have issued those baseline reliability orders. So that's where we are. And then I had one specific suggestion that one of my colleagues brought to me literally as I was walking out the door. So I apologize to the sponsor that I haven't discussed this with her, but it's not huge. If you look at page 5, the definition of dispatchable, we would suggest just a period at demand and deleting the rest, because it doesn't really matter who's requesting it or for what purpose. The point of dispatchability is that it's available on demand. So that was a lot, Mr. Chairman, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Questions for Ms. Throne? Questions? Yeah, Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, would you say that House Bill 200 has done its job? Has it been effective up to this point? And if it has, is it to a point where at some time in the near future, it will probably time itself out?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, I think by and large, you know, despite some difficulties we had implementing it, that it has sort of, you know, looked under the rocks and looked for opportunities. There's always the possibility of developing technology that we don't know about yet. So the final plans are not, we will build this by X. The final plans are more, we're going to continue to look at A, B, and C. I think there has been a suggestion on a companion bill that, you know, the committees could continue to look at these things in the interim. But we're sort of in, I wouldn't say midstream, we're kind of 3/4 of the way across the river at this point. I know we don't have a lot of rivers in Wyoming, so that's kind of a lame analogy for us.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman, on the first part of the bill, I'm just double checking. It doesn't seem like this affects PSC in any way up until we get to the House Bill 200 part, but I just wanted to make sure that's accurate, that the language on page 4, which provides some requirements for the state, I don't think that it affects any PSC issues. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, probably not, but, you know, the loss of primacy for the industries we regulate to the extent that they have to get Class 6 permits or air permits to continue doing what they do. You know, that's never convenient if they have to go to EPA for those things. But that's kind of more putting on my prior life hat, so I should probably stop.
Thank you.
Other questions? Other questions? Other questions? Hearing none. Thank you, Mary, for your testimony. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Any other agencies like to speak on this bill? Any other agencies like to speak on it? Anyone else from any legislators like to speak on it? No? Oh, there's one legislator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Anderson and members of the committee. My name is Laura Pearson. I represent Senate District 14. So I'm in support of this bill 100%. I don't know a lot about all of the different agencies and all of the different entities that this is going to affect. Obviously, I'm new, but I do know that we have to have carbon dioxide in the air for life, for not only plant life, for us. Right now, the carbon dioxide in the air is at 0.04, and if we get below 0.02, plant life, life in general will die. And so when we're thinking about all of these things and the money makers and for the state of Wyoming, and I know I shouldn't be saying this, but we have to think about the livelihood of Wyoming in general. Our ag lands, our range lands, all of these things. And sometimes we have to think, or I do, and part of the reason that I'm here is it's not always about the money. We have to think of the whole picture here. And so that's my testimony. I'm in support of this bill. We have to have carbon dioxide in the air for life.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Laura. Any other legislators? No? All right, any public like to speak on this bill? Any public like to speak on this bill? Jump up all at once and come on up.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask that Brian Sylvia from CO2 Coalition go ahead, because I was going to probably let some of our remarks on whatever it is. So I think somewhere out in the future, and by June.
Okay? I know, yeah. Mhm.
Let's let him go first, and then I'll see what I can do.
Do you want to do the room
Okay.
first?
No, no. Any other from the room? Yes. Come on up. No.
That's what I mean. Should the room go first?
Yeah, yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Jody Levin. I'm here on behalf of the Trona industry. I'll just reference Director Parfit's comments as the basis of why Trona has had concerns with this bill, and that is the potential loss of primacy over the Clean Air Act. The Trona industry has to receive Title V air permits for their operations. We certainly don't want to have to go to the EPA for those permits. It does sound like, I was not aware of potential amendments to fix that concern. It does sound like there's some progress in that area, but we would strongly urge the committee to ensure that the primacy for the state over the Clean Air Act remains. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Travis Deetime, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Mining Association. And, we're neutral on the bill, but I wanted to offer a couple of comments for the committee's consideration. First of all, the industry does agree with testimony here from Mrs. Levin regarding the loss of primacy. I don't want to ever give it back anything to the federal government. So if there's a way, should the committee choose to take up the bill and amend it, that we can ensure that we keep our primacy on those issues, that would be critical for us. And then just the second thing, just in the whole general debate about carbon capture. And, look, I wish I was a magician. A lot of folks think I'm a magician, but I'm not. I wish I was, and I could wave the magic wand and we could go back 25 years and just burn all the coal that we were burning and generate all the power we were producing. At a time in Wyoming when we were producing 20% of the nation's power from Wyoming coal. And, I wish I could go back to those days when we weren't having major urban areas in this country suffering through scheduled rolling brownouts because our power has gotten so shaky. I wish we could just burn coal, but the fact is we can't. We've got an opportunity with a change in federal administration to give us some breathing room. But as I told the House Minerals Committee a couple of days ago, I'm in the political world for going on 30 years. And in that time, I think I've seen 3 permanent majorities at the federal level. My point is the pendulum swings. and we could be in a very different position 4 years from now, from where we are today. You know, we were in a very different position 8 months ago. So I just think, you know, as we're pursuing these issues, I don't think there's a lot of debate on where we want to go. It's how we get there with carbon capture. And I want to make it clear, the coal industry and industry in general is supportive of efforts for carbon capture for emissions. And I want to make that very clear, for emissions. Because if we're going to keep using our coal resource, we've got to find a way to keep it viable with our customers. And our customers are the utilities. And their customers, regardless of where you are, and you know, again, I don't like it, but it is what it is, customers are demanding cleaner emissions. Our soda ash industry, our bentonite industry, when they're pushing their products, their customers are demanding cleaner emissions. So I think we just got to be really careful about this stuff going forward. And again, you know, I appreciate the sponsor of the bill bringing this forward, and you know, the chance to kind of reshape the narrative. I think that's good, but I think we got to keep some things in mind that this state of Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, has been a leader in trying to crack the carbon capture nut, and you know, I just would be very hesitant to see us take the foot off the gas pedal and start pumping the brakes, just because we have a little bit of reprieve here for the next 4 years. And we are going to get a little reprieve, and we are going to see some stuff and go in a different direction. But just to remind the committee, and just use caution because the pendulum swings. And Mr. Chairman, that is my testimony. I would stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Detaille. Any questions for Mr. Detaille? One question over here, yeah. Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Detaille, looking at the specific language on page 4 of the Romanet 3, which is probably the most significant aspect of the legislation, at least for the first half that doesn't affect House Bill 200, it says the state of Wyoming shall not pursue any targets or measures that support the reduction or elimination of carbon dioxide, including any net zero targets. But the kind of key concept there is supporting measures that support the reduction of CO2. So that would include things, as I read it, like the Integrated Test Center and most of the energy matching funds, not most of them, but probably half of the projects that we've got right now for energy matching funds. And it seems to me that your community benefits tremendously from those programs, which would be eliminated. Can you provide us a little bit of context on how your community feels about the elimination of those types of programs?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, Senator Roth, appreciate the question, because it's a good question. And again, I would go back with the work that's being done at the ITC, with the work that's being done at the School of Energy Resources. Yes, we do benefit from it because, again, as I stated in my testimony, the goal is to reduce carbon dioxide from emissions to keep our coal resource viable into the future. So, yeah, that's concerning. Again, that's this body's purview to make those policy decisions, but the industry supports those efforts, and the industry has contributed money to those efforts too. So it's important. We've got to crack the carbon capture nut for viability in the future. Carbon capture for emissions. I want to be very clear on that. So I hope that answers your question,
does.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, appreciate it, Travis.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Detaille, speaking to that same Romanet 3, measures that support reduction or elimination of carbon dioxide. That doesn't speak specifically to emissions or direct air capture. In my opinion, direct air capture would be a reduction. But it's my understanding that we're emitting from generation about 57.5 million tons a year. Is that number correct?
Mr. Chairman, I couldn't comment. I don't know the exact numbers, but we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere with coal-fired power plants. And again, going back to the customer base, customers want cleaner emissions. And if we're going to do it, we've got to do it here in Wyoming.
Follow up, Senator Cooper?
No.
No? Nothing? Thank you, Mr.
And
Detaille.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make clear, I hate this issue. I hate the issue of carbon capture. I hate the issue of carbon dioxide. I wish we didn't have to deal with it. And again, if I was a magician and could wave a magic wand and could make it go away, I would, but we can't. So, you know, I would urge the committee to just keep that in mind.
We'll keep that in mind, that you hate this issue. Yeah, we'll keep that in mind. Mr.
Thank you, Mr.
Deti.
Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Levine. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else like to speak on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joey Karenny. I'm the Executive Director of Rural Wyoming Matters. We're an educational, informational advocacy group out of rural Wyoming. I'm also a carbon-based life form that expels carbon from Carbon County, so this one got my attention. Words have meanings, and I'm a little concerned that we're even considering at this time, at any level, federal, all the way down to local level, carbon dioxide as a pollutant, a contaminant. Also not seeing definition of emission, and I'm worried how far it goes. Like I said, I emit carbon dioxide. But in rural Wyoming, I'm going to point to the Great Seal behind you, where it says on the banners, mines, oil, livestock, and grain. 2 of those produce carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide helps us grow our grain and grass, which we feed to our livestock. Where does it end? At some point, it's what we need, and then the rest of the time, it's regulated so people can feel in control or make money. And when it comes to definitions, regulation, control, and money, just take a look at the forest to the east of the Platte Valley, and you'll see how well money and undefined things and regulation really works. Sometimes you just need common sense. I think this is a fairly good bill, needs to be passed mostly untarnished, but the bottom line is there's things outside of the big industries, the interested parties, the money. There's people that just know what it takes to put a plate on, or put a steak on a plate, and we know that out in rural Wyoming. And any more regulation, any more hidden cost, any more difficulty in continuing to do that, we're going to stop feeding America at a time where I heard earlier, we do have an opportunity to be feeding America better, but it comes down to common sense, being even-handed, even-headed in our approach to that, because we're hoping that we're going to get some relief for 4 years. But hope is a terrible plan. Great motivator. Utilize the time you have to make it better, fix the problem. But we can't hope, like I've heard before, a magic wand comes down because we have a new chief executive in DC that everything's going to get fixed. I would ask that the committee seriously consider the words that are on that Great Seal and realize there's a reason that they're there, and that there's a difference between being a good custodian of the environment, which we believe we are in rural Wyoming, and being a straight environmentalist who has a economical or maybe even regulatory interest in saying who can and can't do what. I know that's a little bit off the topic, but I would go ahead and leave it there and stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Joy. Any questions? Any questions? Hearing none, thank you. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Anyone else like to speak on this? Senate File 92. Anyone else in the room like to speak on it?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Holly Kennedy with the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. Coming here today, neither to speak directly in support or opposition to the bill, but rather to raise some concerns that were passed along from our individual districts across the state. As you may well know, our districts meet annually and pass policy that goes up into our policy book, which is where we derive all our stances from in the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. And we have 2 policies directly related to this bill, and I just wanted to raise some concerns therein. First off, we have policy supporting voluntary participation in carbon markets and carbon sequestration. And then we also have policy supporting private property rights. And that's where our concern lies, is in that intersection of the ability of private landowners to choose what's best for their resource, for their operation, for their private property. And with the way the bill is currently written, it essentially prohibits that as we see it. So just wanted to raise those concerns and to you all on the committee, and happy with that to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Holly. Any questions? Any questions?
Yeah, just
Question here.
Mr. Chairman, thanks, Holly, for being here representing rural Wyoming, no doubt. Did you happen to see the testimony last Friday from a slew of rural Wyoming residents who were against the bill and concerned about its interference of their private property rights and their ability to really transform their ranch operations and other business opportunities, primarily right here in southeast Wyoming? Were you able to hear that testimony?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, yes, I was. Unfortunately, I was across the hall in a different committee on a different bill at that time. But I was able to go back and listen to some of that testimony and would carry on a lot of the same sentiment.
Other questions? Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. What she's referring to is we had 6 landowners in here Friday, and they traveled quite a ways, and so we let them do their testimony on Friday, and then we're carrying the bill forward now. Anyone else in the room would like to speak? Because we have 4 in the Zoom world that would like to speak. We're going to have to limit the Zoom world to about 2 minutes because we're running out of time. So let's go to the Zoom world and bring them in, but let's tell them that they only have about 2 minutes. Is that Kelly?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you okay, and can you limit your testimony to about 2 minutes? Please.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Kelly Carpenter, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. Appreciate the opportunity to join you virtually today. Our members sit in support of this bill, while emphasizing the support lies in eliminating certain terminology associated with the term CO2 and any mandates associated with the removal of CO2. Like the bringer of the bill, we recognize that CO2 plays an important role in agriculture and energy industries in our state and should be managed as a resource and not a pollutant at the state level. In addition, we appreciate the progress in addressing the primacy issue. Should a private property owner desire to store CO2 in their respective pore space, we do believe they should be allowed to do so. I'm not reading the bill in the same way as previous speakers that it would prohibit that. Instead, we do support maintaining private property choice related to carbon sequestration. With that, I'll take any questions you or the committee may have. Thanks.
Questions for Kelly? Any questions for Kelly? Hearing none, thank you, Kelly, for being with us, and we'll move right on to our next speaker, our next Zoomer.
I'm Marcy Shaver from Goshen County. And I have problems with the findings. There's a lot of, you're making decisions based on these findings, but it's missing a lot of information. Since humans entered the ecosphere, we have only lived in a world with CO2 levels of 150 to 280 parts per million until the industrial age. Since then, that number has shot up to over 400 parts per million, and no species on Earth is accustomed to that. We're not adapting to it fast enough. And what it's done is it is a greenhouse gas. It is heating up our atmosphere. This is a high school level experiment in physics, so it's easily replicable. And yes, it is true that the foliage grows more, it's more drought tolerant, but it is not drought resistant. And we saw that in California. They had this lot of rain in the spring, and by now it's just tinder dry and lights off. And what we're doing is setting ourselves up for more fires than we had last season because of the drought that we get between rainstorms. And the last time, it says that the average of 2,600 parts per million, this is about 260 million years ago. That was 259.8 million years before we got here. So we're seeing we're getting warmer, and we can grow longer seasons, and we can grow more kinds of crops. That's wonderful. But we're also bringing in more pests, more weeds, more insects, more invasive animals that are detrimental to our agriculture community. The other point is, despite this lush growth, the nutrient level is going down, and that, which means, okay, how many bales of hay do you feed your herd of cattle? You're going to have to increase that, which increased costs for cattle ranchers. So that's all I've got to say, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you for abiding by our 2 minutes. Any questions for Marcy? Any questions? Any questions? Hearing none, thank you, Marcy. And next up is Catherine.
I'm here, I'm just slow.
Catherine, can you hold your comments to about 2 minutes? We're
I
running-
will do my best, yes.
Thank you.
My name is Catherine Earl. I grew up in Goshen County, born in Laramie, grew up in Goshen County. I have benefited from the fossil fuels in Wyoming for almost 82 years now. But I also had the benefit of a scientific undergraduate education in physics. And as the previous speaker said, it's not just that carbon dioxide is necessary to life, because it is. The problem is we have too much carbon dioxide. And too much carbon dioxide, just like too much water, which Senator Steinmetz will be able to tell you, we experienced a couple of times here recently in Goshen County, when first the irrigation tunnel burst, and then when the canal itself burst. Too much water isn't good for plants either. Too much carbon dioxide is not good for plants as well. So, I agonized over this because my late daughter and her husband were coal miners. My nephew drives a coal train. I have great, great sympathy for the people involved in this endeavor of fossil fuels. But from the Industrial Revolution on, we have been pumping carbon dioxide into the air. And we have enough carbon dioxide for our plants. It's not that we don't. And it's not that we're reducing it, we're increasing it. So I stand firmly against this bill. It's causing CO2 and other greenhouse gases are causing climate change. It exists, it's happening now. Witness the fires we had in Wyoming this last year and those in California recently. Hurricanes are increasing because carbon dioxide warms the air, the atmosphere, and the ocean. And so we are setting ourselves up for major disasters. With that, I stand for questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Any questions for Catherine? Any questions for Catherine? Thank you for your testimony, Catherine. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Up next is Byron.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So for
Byron,
the record, my
say
name is,
to hold it to about 2 minutes, please.
I will do my best. So please stop me if I'm running over the time, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. Thank you. So as I mentioned, for the record, my name is Fritz Byron Supian, and I represent the CO2 Coalition. And I am in support of this bill because CO2 is essential and beneficial for life on Earth. And the other reason is CO2 capture is expensive and unnecessary because of that. So first things first, CO2 is plant food, and scientific findings and studies have found that exposing plants to higher levels of CO2 allows them to grow bigger, produce more food, and better resist drought. And Earth is greening, and NASA has confirmed that 70% of this greening is thanks to CO2. And I also like to point out that CO2 does not control the temperature, as it is actually a weak greenhouse gas, and the warming effect of CO2 actually decreases with each increase in CO2 concentration. And just for your information, the number one greenhouse gas is actually water vapor. And temperature rise began before we start emitting a lot of CO2, and prehistoric CO2 levels, if you go back hundreds of millions of years ago, they have been in the order of 1,000 parts per million. So today's CO2 level is actually very, very small compared to those in the past. And humans have also been exposed to high levels of CO2 in normal conditions. For example, the atmospheric CO2 concentration in 2024, let's say it's about 425 parts per million based on NOAA's Mauna Loa Observatory. And so keep in mind, 425 parts per million versus elevators and large conference rooms, which can have CO2 concentrations of over 600 parts per million. or a small conference room with overcrowding, which can have CO2 concentrations of over 1,200 parts per million, and auditoriums, which can have CO2 concentrations of over 1,600 parts per million, so almost 4 times higher. And submarines can have CO2 concentrations of about 5,000 parts per million, which is 10 times higher than the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And our sailors are doing just fine despite that. And motorcycle helmets with visor closed can also have CO2 concentrations of over 10,000 parts per million, 25 times higher than the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And our motorists, again, are doing just fine despite that. And CO2 only becomes dangerous, at least based on the literature I have encountered, CO2 only becomes dangerous at or above 50,000 parts per million, which is more than 100 times higher than the current atmospheric CO2 level. And as for the expense, so I'm using the number provided by the US Energy Information Administration and the National Energy Technology Laboratory. And
You're over 2 minutes, so can you wrap it up?
Okay, so CO2 capture is expensive. So long story short, to retrofit the 6 long-term Wyoming coal power plants with CO2 capture, it would cost $4.1 billion and also come with a 24% net power output reduction and a 44% increase in operation and maintenance costs. So the ratepayers will actually eventually have to bear that burden. So in summary, CO2 is essential and beneficial for life on Earth, and therefore any measures for controlling CO2 is unnecessary.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for Byron? Any questions? Any questions? Thank you, Byron. Thank you for being with us. Sorry I had to cut you off.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So that's it from the room and from Zoom. Did you want to speak on after Byron?
Yes.
Yes. Can you do that?
Your time is starting now.
Try it and see what you can do.
Is it green?
Is it green? You got
Looks
to push the
green.
button. Okay.
My name's Kevin Kilty. I'm a retired professor of mechanical engineering from the University of Wyoming. What I have to say has nothing to do with the university. I'm a member of the CO2 Coalition, the same as Byron, and I plan to just amplify some of his topics. But I'll just go down 4 points very quickly. If you engage in CO2, it's really CO2 capture that I'm thoroughly against in this, unless it has some economic benefit. And someone mentioned direct air capture. That just put my hair on end. You are fighting the second law of thermodynamics day in and day out to go into that. But let me just make the following comments. Rate increases, electric rate increases. If you retrofit the coal plants that we currently have, you'll probably double rates from those coal plants. And that's because you increase O&M costs, taxes, depreciation, and you increase the rate base. So all of that will have to be taken care of. We'll just leave it that as it is. I had a bunch of great graphs showing you that it is impossible, and I mean that in the scientific sense, impossible, to operate an electric grid without adequate supplies of thermal power. And we saw that just in the last week, and that's what my graphs were about. Wind goes away on its own. Solar disappears when the sun goes down and doesn't reappear till the next morning. During those times when those assets are gone, you have to have thermal plants, and that means coal and gas, and perhaps at some point in the future, nuclear. When people talk about batteries and things like that, it's all far too expensive to run a grid that way. Third point, are there any advantages to capturing CO2? None that I can see. I'll just leave it at that. One of the ironies of limiting CO2 to the atmosphere and trying to capture CO2 is that whatever we do will be undone rather quickly by China, India, and the other 5 or so billion people that live on the planet. Rocky Mountain Power, in one of their IRPs, said that if we close all of our fossil fuel thermal plants, we'll save 50 million tons a year in emissions. That sounds like a lot, but by 2030, China alone will cover that in 22 hours. A year's worth of our efforts covered in 22 hours. You talk about make work jobs where people dig holes and then fill them up again. We're going to dig the holes, and China and India will fill them up again.
That's your 2 minutes, quite a bit over. If you can wrap it up, please, Kevin.
Well, I think one of the important things to think about, there's the endangerment finding, there's West Virginia versus EPA. A lot of these things conflict with one another. There is a changing environment on both CO2, but on thermal fossil fuel fired assets. That's coming from the Federal Regulatory Commission, the Energy Regulatory Commission, the North American Energy Reliability Council, the executives of the big ISOs like PJM and MISO. They all recognize that we're heading into a disaster because we're shutting down coal. When you engage in CO2 capture, you are shutting back coal in a sneaky way because of the parasitic load that the carbon capture causes on your coal plant. And I will just leave it there. I ran over a little bit. I wish I'd spoken earlier. I might have been able to speak longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. And that'll wrap it up for the room. Wraps it up for the Zoom. Right? Yep. So we'll close public comment on Senate File 92. Committee, what's your pleasure? Committee, what's your pleasure? Hearing no motion on the bill, Senate File 92 is no action. Next bill to come before us is Senate File 134. Do you have enough time to do your bill, do you think,
2:15.
Senator?
We go back at.
2:15? Oh, we got plenty of time. All right.
I don't know that we have plenty of time, but.
No, he's got plenty of time. He talks fast.
Talks fast, but he talks a lot.
Was that a question for me, Mr. Chairman? I'll do my best.
All right.
I don't know what the level of testimony is going to be on the bill, but I can certainly get through the bill, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Okay.
So just a little background. The origins of this bill actually kind of come out of the Governor's Wildlife Summit last summer up in Du Bois, Wyoming, that was tremendously well attended. And with all the impacts that are facing Wyoming's wildlife from CWD, invasive species, bisection and migration corridors, loss. A lot of the discussion was what can we do in the state of Wyoming to try to reverse the trend of some of the loss of wildlife. And so a conversation that had with some of the state agencies and members of the executive branches, some of these things are going to be incremental. Members of the committee, this would be an incremental step in that direction. And so what this does, Mr. Chairman, is it goes into the industrial sightings section within the laws. I'm just going to give you a very high-level overview and then go through this. Effectively, what this does would allow industrial sighting payments to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and/or the Wyoming Natural Resource Trust Fund for only, let me specify, for only those unmitigated impacts. Currently, under the existing scenario, while a Game and Fish Department can already submit recommendations on how to mitigate and minimize impacts to wildlife, there's absolutely no provision in state law that allows us to seek compensatory mitigation for impacts that cannot be mitigated by the way we construct the projects. Members of the committee, I would just remind you again that wildlife is the property of the state. When we go through the industrial siting division, we try to make every one of those local communities whole, whether it's the county sheriff's department, roads, water, sewer, emergency services. That's the purpose of industrial siting, is to provide some mitigation funds associated with those projects. As a private landowner, you have the opportunity to negotiate those surface use agreements and come up with a remedy that's acceptable to both. If not, you can always take those to the industrial siting case. This is the property of the people of the state of Wyoming. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department managed that as trust for the people. There's no provision currently in the industrial siting that allows for compensation for unmitigated impacts to wildlife. I know, just to give you an example of the Senator Jones over there in their area, a couple of years ago, we had a solar facility that bisected a migration corridor and just dumped hundreds and hundreds of antelope onto a state highway. Under the scenario, nothing would change. And so what we're looking at is trying to go into the industrial siting divisions and say, look, in the department, I'll just walk you through the bill, Mr. Chairman, but that's why we're here today, is to try to figure out a way to compensate the people of the state of Wyoming for their property, for their unmitigated impacts associated with industrial siting.
Mr. Chairman,
Question here,
just
Senator.
to get to some of these questions because of time and focus where I want to focus on. If an entity is required to pay unmitigated damages, where do those monies go?
So, Mr. Chairman, real quick, and so we have what we do this all the time. We do compensatory mitigation. Sometimes the federal government will require payments, and so we just went through one of these with a lot of this transmission and stuff, where one of the companies was authorized to put some money. That money went to the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund. And so rather than if you can't mitigate it on site, you try to mitigate those habitat impacts. And in that particular case, there was about $10 million that focused on invasive species on other areas like crucial winter ranges, migration corridors, stopover. So that's the way that would be structured, is to try to mitigate those impacts off-site or to other populations or habitats that would compensate for some of those locally impacts on the site of the industrial siting facility.
Oh, question over here. Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I was just wondering, what could be the methods of that? Would it be like a bridge around or taller fences, or what? Could you give us an example of what some of those could be?
So I'll give you probably one of the more classic ones. So let's say you have 25,000 acres of crucial winter range on a south facing slope of 6, and you end up building a facility there. You can't replace that. That's absolutely irreplaceable. Those animals can only survive on those areas. What we can do is go over there and enhance and manage some of that vegetation on the non-impacted areas to try to have a higher carrying capacity. So in other words, we may go in there and do some noxious weed control that's holding back shrub growth or forb production on those sites, or even sage grouse or sagebrush. So we manage that habitat for fashion to increase the carrying capacity would be an example. Other examples may be very well as the scenario you painted. So again, if we're having an impact on migration corridor, and we also know what there's impacts associated with a highway crossing, those industrial siting funds could be utilized to put in highway crossings to make that less hazardous to wildlife, to try to mitigate. So it's a population level thing is what we're looking at for the compensatory mitigation, not an on-site. So think of those deer as they're migrating. I think the record went over there in the Red Desert, hundreds of miles. And so maybe we can't mitigate the impact here, but certainly if we can make that migration corridor more fluid with less obstructions, that's compensatory mitigation. So all those type of activities would be on the table.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, you'd like me to walk you through the bill?
Very quickly.
Well, it's up to you, Mr. Chairman. So it just goes in and creates a new section, 120 under the industrial siting section. It just goes in and says that upon receiving information that the Game and Fish Department can submit request for mitigation efforts. And again, if you go to page 3, it talks about mitigated and unmitigated impacts. It says only for the estimated dollar amount for the unmitigated impacts to wildlife. It allows the department or eligible entities, which would be the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund and the Game and Fish Department, to negotiate with those project proponents. If they come up to an agreement on what that mitigation is, that's presented at a public meeting. Mr. Chairman, if you go over to page 4 and 5, that just puts the duty on the council to go out for public notices. The council shall include payments in the application. Brings in this eligible entity. You'll see this. This is Game and Fish Department is already part of the consultation for industrial siting, but it's for the mitigated component, not the unmitigated component. And so this continually talks about the dollar amount of the unmitigated damages for those impact payments. The eligible entity has to present those information, justify those before the council, provides that the council can review those. They do not have to agree to fund those. That's a decision of the council, just like everything else the council does for any local government payments for that. The wildlife impacts are paid to either the department or the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund. Mr. Chairman, we go over to page 7. This is the eligible entity must keep records available to the public to document, similar to any other industrial siting type process. And so, Mr. Chairman, we get into page 8, 9, and 10. This just brings in those other conforming statutory areas. So we bring in the Wildlife Trust Fund, says they're eligible to apply. Under the referrals, that deals with county commissioners. If they apply to industrial siting for a wind or solar facility that's not quite large enough to meet the industrial, that's a county application, say we want to view this as an industrial siting and go through that. It just says, under those scenarios where county brought that in, the Game and Fish Department or the Wildlife Trust Fund could seek unmitigated damage for those. 18.5.11, just as the Board of County Commissioners, this is a revocation of permits. It just says if they didn't meet their wildlife mitigation components associated with the agreements and the payments, those permits could be, and then the powers and duties, 35, that gets back to the Industrial Siting Council under that. And then if we go over to page 10, these are all conforming amendments to just talk about that it's applicable to this new section. 120 under industrial siting brings in new definitions at the bottom of page 10 and on to 11. The eligible entity means Wyoming Game and Fish Department and the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund would be the only entities that could be eligible to apply for monetary compensation for unmitigated impacts to wildlife. And then we get down to the page 11. Again, this is just at the request of those eligible entities. Says the department or the industrial siting can provide technical assistance to those agencies. Again, Mr. Chairman, you move over to page 12. It just brings in the other eligible entity under this is the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Account Board that you see on page 12. Mr. Chairman, that's the bill.
Questions? Questions for the maker? Senator Jones.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, am I taking this right that these siting fees would be separate? They wouldn't be taken out of what a community would receive?
That's correct. These would be on addition. They don't come out of any of the counties, cities, towns, any of those other, they would be on top of those fees. That's correct.
Senator Northcott.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Senator, is there anybody in favor of this bill from the industry that you're aware of?
Madam Chairman, I can't speak for all the folks.
Just want to make sure they feel heard, that they are all in opposition to being exposed to unmitigated fees. Thank you.
Senator Rothfuss.
I did just want to go back to the question a moment ago about whether this counts towards or against the cities, towns, and counties. It will be counted under the cap. There's nothing in here that precludes it from the cap. So if you're reaching one of our statutory caps, this would be potentially competing against other funds, I believe. Is that accurate, Senator Hicks?
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, it may, but just keep in mind there was some other legislation that raised those caps and then segregated those out. And I can't speak to whether those caps have ever been met before.
Right.
That's data, so I'm assuming that those caps would still apply. But again, we're looking at those facilities of 350 million or 600 million, and then a percentage of the sales tax goes to those distributions. Whether we've ever hit those, I can get that data for you.
Follow up, Senator
Just,
Rothfuss?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, and I don't think we've had any problems in the past with hitting caps, but just to be clear that it is part of that same percentage funding, yeah.
Other questions? Other questions? Other questions? Good.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss or Senator Northcott.
Let's try that again, yeah. Senator Hicks, is there a specific example in mind to tell the story of why this is important? I know you mentioned the solar facility. Is there any other examples? And then further conversation about caps associated with how big these damages could be, just because I understand industry's concern that it could be extensive. But I think there's a good story to tell and our obligation to the wildlife, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, or Mr. Chairman, Senator Nethercott, if I may. So I think one of the really classic examples, when you look at that, when we start looking at the cumulative impact of these industrial sidings, and particularly in my part of the state, it's one industrial siding facility on top of another industrial siding facility. So this last program that came out where there was a requirement for some mitigation associated with degradation of habitat, and there was some compensatory mitigation put out that the Wildlife Trust Fund received, was to start looking at broad-scale, well-coordinated efforts to do invasive annual grass control across all of those migration corridors, those crucial winter ranges. So a very broad coordinated effort. And so we've seen this type of thing happen in the past, but those were payments that weren't necessarily specified by our industrial siding. It was terms and conditions under a federal environmental impact statement that this said there's a potential in a negotiated agreement that this would be part of the compensatory mitigation. We may have these facilities strictly on private or state lands and stuff, but it's a tool in Wyoming's toolbox, and it's a may, it's not a shall. And it's been my experience, the industry has been very good to work with when it comes to impact or mitigating wildlife impacts, but I think it has broad applications for a number of scenarios. And we've seen this in Carbon and Sweetwater County work very well, running those funds, those compensatory mitigations funds through the trust fund, because they leverage it with so many other funds and programs that it becomes a well-coordinated, and that's why they're included in here as it's eligible to apply.
Other questions for the maker? Other questions? Seeing none? Thank you, Senator Hicks. Anyone else, any agencies like to speak on Senate File 134?
Why don't we ask how many people intend to speak on this bill? Because we can see if we need to move it over. I think we will.
I'll do that after this one.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
committee members. Angie Bruce, Director, Wyoming Game and Fish. With me today is Doug Brimeyer. He's the Deputy Director. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about our role now and what we currently do to give you some perspective. So we have a specific section within the department that does wildlife environmental reviews on basically anyone who asks for them, anywhere from 200 to 1,000 a year. This comes from city, counties, state, federal agencies. We are not a permitting agency. We simply review projects and give recommendations. We do play an active role when it comes to our federal planning, though. Through the NEPA process, we're very proactive. Other than that, we wait for an applicant to send their information to us to ask for a request to review. Again, we're not regulatory, so we simply give recommendations to develop in a way that has minimal impact on wildlife and fisheries resources in the state. So this may be shifting development, location, ways to minimize the impact, different techniques we've learned over the years, especially with things like oil and gas. We're a pro at working with them. Not as much science and knowledge behind solar and wind, what we're talking about today. But really that technical assistance, what we provide to industry, is really focused on eliminating or decreasing those impacts to wildlife in the state. To give you an example of our effectiveness to date, a few years ago, we did a survey of our proponents, so those people asking us for review, and 81% of those who responded implement over half of our recommendations. So a pretty good result on a voluntary basis. And then only 10% did not implement any of our recommendations. So again, I think this bill has that impact to the department. It has the ability to have an impact to wildlife in the state, but it really lays more of a framework for mitigating those impacts at a much higher level than what we do now. So with that, I'll just stand for any questions.
Any questions? Any questions for Angie?
I have one, Director.
Director of Game and Fish. Oh. You have a question?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Director Bruce, I was just wondering that mentioned solar farm over in my part of the state. Do you know if, I know you weren't director then, but are you aware if they asked for a wildlife review on that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones, absolutely. So that was on BLM land. And so, of course, we're actively involved in those projects. And we actually asked for some modifications to that project quite a bit with our federal partners. And to be honest, we didn't get listened to. What we did get out of that project, though, because they were only doing an environmental assessment, not an EIS or environmental impact statement. So they did listen to us and put a requirement in there for the proponent to do a research project. Our local biologist felt that it would have an impact on the antelope in the area, and then we proved so. 2 years later, with a bad winter, they were trapped. They were herded up on the road in a dangerous situation. And then the research that came about looking at that did show that solar facilities located in the wrong spot. Again, it's really about locating them correctly, because if locating in the wrong spot, not only can they be a loss of habitat for our big game species, but in this case, it actually had a secondary effect where it blocked movement to additional resources during severe winter. So those antelope were affected. What that has done, though, is provided a necessary information and research that we can apply it to our recommendations in the future. So we learned from it.
That do it?
That's your story.
That's your story, and your tick is sticking to it, huh?
That's your story.
Any other questions for the director? Any other questions for the assistant director, the deputy director? No, none? Okay, thank you. Thank you, director. How many more people are going to speak on this bill? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
Anyone travel?
Anyone travel very far to get here to talk to us? What, did you travel? Why don't you come up and speak, and we may have to carry this bill over. Denver's a long ways.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to comment. I did come to all the previous meetings, so I'm feeling a little bit of a cough coming on. I might not make it to the next one, so I appreciate the chance to comment. And I'll be quick. In short, we do respectfully, I'm sorry, Kara Choquette. I work for Power Company of Wyoming. I'm developing a wind farm south of Rawlins in Carbon County, Transwest Express, as well as a broader portfolio of companies that we're calling the Wyoming Clean Power Center. So we are planning to develop additional wind, additional solar, battery storage, and hydrogen-capable natural gas turbines. We respectfully request a no vote on Senate File 134. This bill says it is about requiring the payment of wildlife mitigation impact costs. And at least our experience is that is already happening. So this bill appears duplicative and/or redundant with existing practices. We work with both the BLM and Wyoming Game and Fish to assure environmental and wildlife impacts are addressed. We pay a lot of money to avoid, minimize, and then mitigate those impacts to the extent practical. There's extensive consultation on a project with Wyoming Game and Fish. They've developed these very formal wind and solar energy guidelines, which are available on their website. They were just updated in 2021. Their recommendations are provided to and then adopted by the permitting agency, which is the Industrial Siting Division. And those guidelines address siting, monitoring, mitigation, and data collection on all new installations. And again, we pay for all of that work. So you asked for stories. I'll give you a couple of stories. One, our work to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to golden eagle populations. The work we have done, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service analysis, was that our project will actually have a net benefit to golden eagles because of all the work we're doing to preserve and enhance habitat for this important species. And relative to sage grouse, again, we've done more, I think, than any other project in Wyoming about truly understanding what is the habitat that sage grouse use across the Overland Trail Ranch, using all that data to site the project, and then for those impacts like disturbance that we can't avoid, we have a really cool mitigation project that we're doing right now and just posted about on our website, where our data showed about 126 acres of relic ag fields that once upon a time, previous to the company's ownership of the ranch, they tried to grow wheat in this part of Carbon County. Didn't work. That habitat was basically non-existent for sage grouse, and the data showed that. We've gone in as part of our mitigation to restore that habitat, reseeding, investing in irrigation, investing in snow fences to try to bring the moisture back to that site, and making sure we're not only expanding the habitat for sage grouse, but filling in some really important gaps in the landscape. And again, we're paying all of that cost. It's not cheap to hire PhD ecologists and biologists that are doing this sort of mitigation work, which again, there's just so much to avoid, minimize, and mitigate that costs millions of dollars, including staying out of sage grouse core areas. So again, I would just encourage your no vote. Please don't add more complexity and costs to projects that are already happening via processes that assure Wyoming energy development happens alongside environmental and wildlife protection. The only other thing I would note is I'm not aware at the end of this process of any impacts that aren't mitigated through that avoid, minimize, mitigate hierarchy through the processes that exist right now, and the great oversight and cooperation we have with Wyoming Game and Fish and their experts and the Industrial Siting Council and their experts.
Very good. Any questions for Kara? Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and I have a question. Is it the choke cherry? Is that the correct one? Okay, I was wondering, did you use Game and Fish for the wildlife review process? And if so, did they find any areas they asked you to do anything different? And did you follow their recommendations?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Jones, I am not the biologist who worked most closely on this, but I guarantee you we have a very good, close working relationship with Wyoming Game and Fish. One of the aspects of these wind energy and solar energy guidelines is forming a technical advisory committee. So we have a committee that's made up of our biologists, our staff, and Wyoming Game and Fish. We just submitted actually our annual report to them, I think last week, and we do field tours. So they're coming out and inspecting and looking at the work we're doing to make sure the commitments that we make are actually being done on the ground.
Follow-up? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Choquette, I do have a question about, the structure of this is about unmitigated impacts, and it's spending state money for unmitigated impacts. What you described was direct mitigated impacts paid for by industry. I guess I'm struggling to understand why this bill is a problem, because the intent of it is if there are unmitigated impacts that were not covered in everything that you described, then it would allow for local sales and use taxes to be deployed in conjunction with Game and Fish to address those and perhaps even in a broader scale. So I'm struggling to understand why your objections target this bill.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, if we read the bill mistakenly, our apologies. We thought that this was requiring additional payment from the developer, which is not the case right now through the industrial siting process. So if there was an additional fee on top of everything else we're doing and have to pay for, we would definitely not support that.
I don't think it does that. We didn't walk through the bill in detail, but I don't think it does that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
What I would ask right now is to allow Senator Hicks to come back up and walk through that detail carefully so that industry in the room may be less interested in speaking to the bill. And then, so if we could do that out of order, that may be helpful, and have the testimony, if any, be more direct.
Could we do that, Kara? That would help us. Senator Hicks, would you like to enlighten us on that, please?
Mr. Chairman, if you'll go to page 2. This is the scenario that I think that Ms. Croquette just provided.
Turn your mic on.
Just provided. So under those scenarios where you have some environmental impact statement or whatever, so what I want to point out to you, if you go to the top of page 3. It says the mitigated and unmitigated impacts that construction of an industrial facility will have on wildlife. The estimated dollar amount for the unmitigated impacts to wildlife. Any other reports required by rule of council. But here's the operative component. When you get into subsection 3, before submitting, and this is the scenario that I think was just described to you. Before submitting an application under this subsection, the eligible entity may negotiate with the applicant of an industrial facility, determine and agree upon the Wyoming amount of wildlife impact to be made for the eligible entity. So there's already this process that's built into place. And so that would only come into case if there is any unmitigated impacts. This only deals with those, not the scenarios that we're driving, all the efforts that industry put out there right now. This is when we identify something that you just can't mitigate. And I think this is to Senator Rothfuss's, it's not in lieu of. You don't have to pay this. If you can mitigate those impacts, and the Industrial Siting Council and the Game and Fish Department agree on those, that is a mitigatable impact, there's no more duty or payment associated with that under the construct of the bill. And if we need to make that a little clearer, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure we can do that.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
So, as I look at the bottom of page 6, the G paragraph, the applicant shall make all wildlife impact payments as required in the council's decision or order. The applicant shall make the payment to the state treasurer, who shall distribute the payment to the eligible entity. I can see language here that does make it look like industry is responsible for making additional payments. That's certainly not what I took the intent as, but I can see the language there, and maybe between now and next meeting, when we finish up on this, we need to figure out what the amendments are to get it to the point where we're just doing unmitigated impacts through the standard industrial siting process, so nobody has any problems with it.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's possible. Obviously, I don't know if that level of concern here that we're going to be able to address this bill today before we have to go back up, but I can certainly work on the industry with some of those amendments if they're interested, and members of this committee.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll close public comment and continue on at our next meeting on Wednesday, the 5th, I believe that'll be. We'll continue with Senate File 134 to bring it to completion. Thank you. And with that, we'll close